Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson, and today I'm speaking with Tom O'Neill. Tom is a fascinating author who wrote a book called Chaos. It's about the 1960s, mind control experiments, MK Ultra, and goes really deep into the story of Charles Manson and how he was being used by the CIA. Really fascinating stuff. I found his book in 2020 and I listened to it on audio, and then I read the actual physical book. And he also has some really good podcasts out there where he's being interviewed by Joe Rogan. And I highly recommend you go back and listen to that interview. He also has a couple other interviews if you want to get into this conversation. One of those would be Rick Rubin. He did a good interview with Tom O'Neill as well. So we picked this conversation up pretty far along into the story, and I felt like he had already answered a lot of questions about the book. So I had some different types of questions, and we had a really fun conversation, but I highly recommend you go back, either listen to his book on audio or read the book, or listen to his conversation with Joe Rogan or Rick Rubin. Those people will help you to fill the void. Tom spent 20 years writing this book, and he didn't even expect to do that. He thought it was going to be a 3-month project, so it's pretty fascinating. I seem to find this whole subject matter to be one of the most interesting subjects of recent American history. It's the development of the CIA and how they were experimenting on their own citizens and how it shaped consciousness. And I'm curious how those programs evolved and became more sophisticated and how they're being used today. So I don't know why more people aren't interested in this subject. It's fascinating to me, but I sure am, and I found Tom O'Neill's book to be probably the #1 book written on the subject matter. And it seems to me that when Trump got shot and when there's certain school shooters, his book sales go through the roof, and there's probably good reasons for that. Be curious, be open-minded, and have fun listening to this conversation. Enjoy. Well, thanks, Tom.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ryan.
Absolutely.
Or me having you here, I guess.
Totally, yeah. I'm in your little space, and
uh,
it's nice to chat with you because I've been interested in your work since 2020, when your book came out just before that, and I heard you on an interview, and I've been interested in this subject matter for quite a long time, and you made me get even more interested in it, so I appreciate your
I
work.
apologize.
Yeah, it's a rabbit hole,
Uh,
and I don't know how many people on the planet really go through the effort to do what you've done. Probably not many, but
yeah.
you spent 20 years of your life in a field of interest that you didn't plan to be interested in.
Yeah, and counting, because I'm working on a follow-up, so now it's 25 years.
Amazing.
And I didn't plan on doing the follow-up either, but once the book came out, information kept coming in, and if you read the book, you see I was really frustrated by not getting enough definitive answers. In the book, I found a lot of, I think important information, but I'm hoping to be able to kind of bring closure to the open-ended stuff in a second book.
Amazing. Yeah, I'd like to see a second book and like a docu-series. I think everybody that got into your work is like cliffhanger. And I wonder what your percentages of what you learned about the nature of this stuff during Chaos and the MK Ultra and the CIA and all this stuff with Manson from your book.
Yeah.
What do you think the percentage of things that you had to leave out were?
Oh my gosh.
80, 60?
Well, there's two kinds of what was left out. I would say 90% of stuff was left out because it didn't prove to be relevant to the main subject, but fascinating, colorful stuff from the same period. Interviews I did with people surrounding the murders originally, the Tate and LaBianca murders, friends of the victims, really crazy experiences I had trying to get information from people. And I have chapters of stuff that I wrote, and then my collaborator went over and tweaked and did what he did, that didn't end up in the book because we had too much material that was vital to telling the story that we were trying to keep what theater actor people call a through line.
Right.
So if you want to go from the beginning to the middle to the end and stay on course, and I kept going off.
Yeah.
It's another reason I needed a collaborator, because I had lost kind of perspective. I couldn't see, as they say, the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
So much stuff was cut away that I loved. And I don't even know if that's going to end up in the second book unless I can tie it into Jolly West, CIA and all that. But there was important information that also didn't make the book for space purposes. And that was the only way I could kind of leave that out, was by thinking, hey, you know what, maybe I'll do a second one after this and I can use it then. And, I think 2 years of my reporting on the Robert Kennedy assassination, for instance, in Jonestown, which I didn't find any evidence that one particular psychiatrist, Jolly West, was connected to Robert Kennedy's assassination like he was to the aftermath of John Kennedy's assassination, and at least circumstantially to the creation of the Manson family and the hate in '67 through the clinic.
Amazing.
But I didn't find any of his fingerprints in RFK. I'm not at all persuaded that they aren't there, but I didn't find them.
Right.
So I had to push aside all my RFK stuff, even though it's a very parallel story.
Yep.
And Jonestown, actually, there's a little more circumstantial information that he might have been involved in what I think was the creation of a laboratory in Guyana by the CIA, using Jim Jones as a conduit to these people and the experimentation that was going on there. But, my book was already too long. Luckily, I had a fantastic publisher who agreed to give me a lot more pages. But if we had put all that stuff in, it would have, I don't know if people would have bought the book, because they say people don't want to buy big, doorstop 1,000-page books.
Right. And your new book, is it going to focus on way outside of Manson? Then you're going to get into the broader spectrum of the CIA.
Well, actually, but still, no, I'm really still focused on what happened to Manson before he was released from prison in '67, and working up a case that there was stuff going on prior to his release that explained what happened after his release. But yeah, also bleeding into these other events, not much beyond 1975 or so, still Jonestown, Robert Kennedy, a couple other national events that I think might have been somehow influenced by what our government was doing, or manipulated by it. All that said, I got to also add a disclaimer that I haven't committed to doing the second book yet, because I'm not going to do it unless I can get, definitive, documentary, proven, conclusive evidence of this stuff.
Yeah.
So I've got a publisher who wants me to do it, an agent and a collaborator, but I still haven't promised to do it yet. And I like the fact that I haven't signed any contracts, because I can still work at my leisure. The minute they pay you, then all of a sudden you got to produce, which can be a double-edged sword. It took me 20 years.
Right.
The last time, and I'm not going to live long enough probably to do another 20-year project. But it's in the works, and hopefully it'll happen.
Yeah. And I'm curious about, people need prerequisites for this subject matter, because even to get to the conversation we're having, it's hard, go back and listen to an interview with Rick Rubin or Joe Rogan or somebody to get the context, and then maybe read the book twice if you have to.
Don't tell that if people get scared.
There's just so much in it. And
then
there's
exposition. So it's one of the reasons I had a really hard time presenting the material, because to begin with, the Manson case is such an insane case, and you have to tell what the official narrative is before you debunk it. And just telling that official narrative takes chapters and chapters, because it's about a race war and a hole in the desert where a group of people thought that they could live off of the fruit of underground magical trees and rivers of honey and syrup, and prophecies in the Bible, and that Manson heard through the Beatles. So you got to get all that out there to explain, well, I don't think it happened this way, but we were given this story in order to cover up this information. So it's really hard. And again, if I hadn't had Dan, my collaborator, I don't think it ever would have come out, because he was really good at kind of streamlining everything with me and saying, get rid of this, get rid of that. God. This is what's
keep
important.
You on track.
Yeah.
Because it seems so easy to go down the rabbit hole and get so spread thin.
and there's a big, giant, overarching story that's like
Yeah.
the CIA was developed right after World War II
Mm-hmm.
from paperclip,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems like, okay, why aren't we? That could be a story of its own that goes on for thousands of pages of
Right.
the development of the CIA.
Right.
And
Right.
then you're just trickling forward, and you're like, oh my God, it's tied into all these sub programs. And
Yeah.
when they got into MK Ultra, which there wasn't much out there because it almost got swept under the rug and no one ever
Yeah.
knew anything about it.
I read it. I said in the book, I never heard of MK Ultra when I was doing this. Before doing this, I never heard of COINTELPRO, of Chaos, all the stuff that I had to. And I think that does maybe work for the book because the book is told in the first person as I stumble through these passageways where all of a sudden I'm like, wait, there was something called MK Ultra, which was a government brainwashing program where they secretly fucked around with people's memory and minds without the people knowing it. That couldn't be true. And then I find out, well, it was true. And there were congressional investigations and a couple books, like 2 or 3 at the time, not a lot. So it was a learning process for me that I didn't, which worked again, maybe to my benefit, because I went in there skeptical first skeptical, and then my mind started opening to the possibility, and I became more objectively kind of directed.
Jeez.
But if I had gone in there already biased, it might have been a problem.
Sure. That's what I liked best when I discovered you, is that you weren't planning to even write about Manson. You didn't really want to.
Yeah, never had read the book,
like,
book either, just not at all curious about Manson.
Yeah,
when
you got
my
a good
editor
deal.
signed it, I was like, yeah, I could use the money. I'll do it. What, 3 months? Yeah, 3 months, $5,000. I'll do it.
Which never ended up happening because they went under. And then you got stuck on a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay. And the rabbit hole that drove you for 20 years, was it your underlying, was it driving because you just had to, because you knew there was so much in it that you wanted to expose, like you almost felt obligated?
Well, no, yes and no. I mean, the main thing was I couldn't get the answer. And I kept thinking I'm just a few weeks,
it's like a carrot
months. Dangling. Yeah, exactly. A carrot on a stick. I kept thinking I'm getting closer and closer. And I had an agent after the second year who knew we had a book, and he kept saying, you can't keep doing this. And then it's like 5, 10 years. He goes, you've got enough information. And I'm like, no, but I know I can get that smoking gun.
Interesting.
And he's like, you have a lot of smoking pistols. And I go, but I need the gun. I need finality.
So you were more single oriented too. I would have thought it would have taken you into like more obsession with like the development of the CIA. Where are they at now? What's the nature of the programs? Because that's where my mind goes. I'm more curious, like, what the fuck is all this? This is incredible. Our whole CIA is, it's not like these programs go away and dissolve and become a mystery. It's like, no, they get more complicated.
Oh, yeah. No, that was one way I was able to put a cap on it, by
doing that,
by not going beyond a certain period. So the CIA, we only found out that this program existed, MK Ultra, in 75, 76. And at the time, the CIA, there were congressional hearings. They claimed that they had ended the program in 73. They destroyed all the records in 73. And then during the congressional hearings, they said the entire operation, though it was the most expensive endeavor they'd ever undertaken, and though it had lasted 20 years, they said we got nothing fruitful from it. It was a big failure.
Yeah.
They allowed themselves to look like fools, but I found out that was a lie.
Yeah.
And I found out that they had, in fact, developed the technology to do, what their main objective was, which was, as my main psychiatrist said in his report to them, that they concealed from Congress when they had the hearings, that he had developed the technology using hypnotism and sensory deprivation and certain psychedelic drugs to remove someone's true memories and replace them with false memories. And as he wrote, without the subject being aware that they'd been tampered with. So I still thought I can't go beyond 73, 74. Let's just limit it to that.
Yeah.
And I get asked all the time. In fact, I did an interview for Wired magazine a few days ago. And the main thrust of the interview was, it was a result of, the shooting of Trump last week, because now there's a whole new interest in, the motivation or possible motivation of the guy who was killed, after he shot into the rally, you know, whether or not he was somehow manipulated, and that they all want to know, not just the wire guy, but do I think it's still going on?
Sure.
And I said, I have no idea. You know, I don't know where to look.
Yeah.
And I said, I think they're really good at not, you know, sharing that information.
Sure.
They're never going to tell anyone.
Yeah, and distracting everyone with other stuff.
Yeah, but I do know that they're capable of it, that if they want to do it, they can do it.
Yeah.
And I believe they have done it in the past, but I don't know
Yeah.
if that was a random, isolated lunatic,
Yeah.
or if there was something. That's not even, you know, that's
Yeah.
not my area anymore, because my information, my knowledge ends at like 73, 74, what they learned up till then.
Yeah.
And then what they did to hide it then. But I just, my blanket answer is I would be really surprised if they weren't using the technology that I know that they were developing at least through 73 and 74.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be really surprised if they stopped the program when they said they did. But I have no evidence of it because they're really good at hiding that stuff.
And imagine how much more sophisticated even a smartphone is now compared to a computer in 74.
Exactly, yeah.
And you're like, these programs and these intelligence agencies, once they got the social sciences down, the behavioral sciences understood pretty well, especially when I got into John Marx's book, which you led me to. Your work actually helped people to get more interested in the original story, which to me was like the big story of this is what these MK Ultra programs really did. And it was so in depth. I could read that book 3 times and be like, Jesus, there's so much in this.
Yeah, you should see my copy. It's so worn. There's another great book. It's really hard to get that came out shortly after John Marx's book called The Mind Manipulators by Alan Shefflin.
Okay.
Who's a medical doctor and an attorney. He's John Marx's age, probably in his early 80s now. I hope he's still alive. He was really helpful to me. That book is, you know, I think it had 1 printing. It's like a Bible. It's so full of information, but it's all sourced.
Cool.
And I only was able to access it by going to the Los Angeles Public Library where they had it on reserve. So I couldn't take it out, but I could go in. And at some point they should do a reprinting of that. But that's a really good resource in addition to The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marx.
Wow.
For people who are interested in the subject.
Yeah, that would be nice if they would reprint that.
Yeah.
Especially now more than ever, because when you see things like what happened the other day with Trump, and you're looking at the world now, it's almost so blatant. It's almost like we're not even trying to hide anymore. We're trying to help you get aware. Not saying we, but the nature of it just always seems so like in your face.
Yeah.
To where they're almost part of the op to me is like, let's get everybody very distrusting of the system, which puts people into a state of, you know,
they
frantic.
Call it a strategy of tension.
Exactly.
I still don't know that that's what's happening.
Sure, and
I just know it's very possible.
It's fun to speculate.
Yeah,
it's
possible. I'm open to it. Every time there's a school shooting.
Yep, exactly.
My book sales go up, and people contact me, and I have to say the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, that's not, I have no idea. I have no insight. I'd share it if I had that information, but I don't know if that's what's happening.
And it's so easy to radicalize people now more than ever with the screens.
With the internet.
Yeah. And the dopamine hits, and they've got the weapons of mass distraction on top of the soma effect, which is Aldous Huxley's word of, you know, keep people numb and happy, and they're almost giving you their information, the attention war. And I don't like to get all like, oh, this is where it's going, but it's fun to be curious.
Yeah.
And I look at it without paranoia, which is a blessing, because I'm happy to be alive, and I'm like, hey, if we're all gonna die.
If you took it too seriously,
you're gonna be a mess. I'm more just like, this is the most interesting story on the planet, especially in Western, you know, American history. I think it's the most important piece to look at, because from the 50s onward, it goes into like, well, our whole society is being shaped by some form of social engineering.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And you're like, oh, how much has that impacted me and everyone else? And it becomes a nice, fun, curious rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And your book really just exposes some of the key elements that help you go, Jesus, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah. There's another great guy. You're in Scottsdale or Phoenix?
Phoenix, but close to Scottsdale.
He was in Phoenix, yeah. Robert Kaiser, who wrote RFK Must Die, really the first book about the Robert Kennedy assassination. And he was working for Sirhan's defense team. Well, first a prosecution, then a defense team. And I told you earlier when we weren't on camera that I went to Phoenix once to interview him. And he was just another guy who had kind of been radicalized. And I'm not using that in a bad way, but his whole thought process changed when he witnessed the Sirhan trial. And,
Okay.
you know, in his first book, he suggested the possibility that Sirhan had been programmed. And the book came out, I think, about a year after the verdicts and Sirhan had been sentenced. Then he kept following the case, you know, parole hearings, doing more reporting. And then he published a new edition of the book a few years later, which you have to get because it has the afterword or epilogue or whatever update, where he presents a completely revised,
updated version
of how he thinks that the only way this happened was because Sirhan had been programmed prior to going into the pantry.
Interesting.
And he was in Phoenix, and he just died a couple of years ago. But
dang,
that's the sad part about this. So many of the people I've interviewed aren't around anymore, and I do acknowledge them in the book. And I wish they were alive to see the book. I think he would have been happy with it, and he really helped me a lot.
Wow. Did you ever find yourself feeling like you were in danger? I know you think with Bugliosi and stuff, it got pretty crazy.
Oh, yeah. That's really, I mean, that's another question I hear a lot. Not, you know, early on the first year when I was looking at this kind of drug cabal of guys from Canada who were buying and selling drugs to the community that the victims lived in, you know, in Hollywood and Benedict Canyon. And they ended up spending quite a bit of time at the house on Cielo and having conflicts with some of Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate's friends who were coming in and out of there. And they were the first suspects. Two of the four guys was still alive when I was reporting this, and I was interviewing them, and they were threatening me. You know, and they were senior citizens. One was in a wheelchair in a nursing home, and once I took him out, it's in the book, to Coco's, I think, for lunch. And he was a scary guy. I mean, he had been a Marine, a sniper.
Wow.
He was about 6'7", and he supposedly could kill people with his hands. But when I interviewed him, you know, an orderly and I lifted him and put him in the front seat of my car. And then when we got to Coco's, he had to put his arm over my shoulder, and I had to put him into the chair.
Dang. Pretty vulnerable, you know?
And he's threatening to kill me while I'm doing that.
Wow.
So I didn't really take it that seriously. But no, I really wasn't scared until 5 years later when Vince Bugliosi, the prosecutor, who by then I knew what a dangerous person he was and how mentally unhinged he was. And he was threatening me. And I knew he still had connections and power in law enforcement in Los Angeles, even though 70% of the people I interviewed who knew Bugliosi when Bugliosi was a deputy DA at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, and then a defense attorney in the early 70s, and also a candidate for attorney general of the state and district attorney. 70, 80, 90% of the people said he's mentally ill, he's insane.
Right.
And he lies, and he's corrupt.
So no one could trust him anyway.
Nobody could trust him anyway, but he was dangerous because people who didn't know his history would assume that somebody who had such a famous prosecution of probably until OJ, the most notorious crime in Los Angeles, and then wrote a book about it that to this day is still the best-selling true crime book of all time. You know, they're going to take his word over me, who hadn't published yet.
Wow.
And he was threatening all kinds of things. He was going to spread misinformation. I mean, he told me this.
Yeah. He lost it.
That he would hurt me like I'd never been hurt before.
And he's tied to probably some big political folks that I remember you canceled one of your interviews with that one fella that
Arlen Specter.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Yeah. That was something, another thing that, you know, sometimes I lose sleep thinking.
You wish you would have done that one.
Yeah. You know, at the time I did a calculation and I talked to my agent who was completely plugged into what I was doing. Because I said, I can't make this decision alone. It's in the book, and so I won't bore people, but it took me forever to get Senator Arlen Specter, who was the author of the famous magic bullet theory for the Warren Commission. He was an investigator in the JFK assassination, to agree to look at the information I had that Jack Ruby had been brainwashed prior to his testimony. And he agreed to do that because he had participated in the testimony. It was only him, Gerald Ford, and the head of the Warren Commission, Earl Warren, who were in the room when they had to end it because Jack Ruby was rambling incoherently.
God, it's amazing.
But Specter was running for re-election in Pennsylvania, my home state. I was there, and he agreed to give me time finally But what I was worried about was once I gave him this information and these documents, he needed to be reelected. He was, for the first time in his career, threatened by his opponent to losing this election. And he was very power hungry. He'd been like the longest running senator, I think, in the state.
Wow.
And I thought...
And you dig this up right then.
Yeah, and I thought he can use this to his advantage and put it out there and manipulate it before I have it in my book. So I canceled it at the last minute. And then there's a funny thing that happened after where he starts calling looking for me, even though I left word that I told a lie. I said I had an emergency and I had to get in a plane and leave. But he's calling my mother at her nurse home, and my mom's lying to him.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's how personal it was, because he knew if you open this can of worms with this much information.
Yeah.
And even that could be a book of its own. The Jack Ruby, Kennedy, because that just gets so fascinating. You're like, did he really?
Yeah.
I mean, all this stuff is just so curious,
Yeah, there's so many magic doors.
And there's so many doorways, and you're like, okay, if you could write a fiction, I always thought you should consider a fictional novel.
I would have maybe, but once you do the nonfiction, it's like not in your DNA anymore, because you're so, at least I am, so dedicated to not putting anything in the book that's remotely not documented.
Right.
And I mean, the freedom to just make stuff up. And, that's what James Ellroy does. He wrote one of the most thrilling books about another famous crime hero, probably the most famous before Tate LaBianca, the Black Dahlia murder, which still really has not been solved officially.
Yeah.
And he wrote this amazing novel based on the facts, and he got to do exactly what you're talking about.
The freedom to just really go into the...
It's such a great read, but it's frustrating as a nonfiction investigative journalist knowing that everything I'm reading, 70% of it is a fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just would love to know I guess you don't, maybe you have really good restrictive ability to not go there, at least on record, but you just seem like you keep yourself really rooted and grounded, which is nice.
It's the only way to do a book like this.
Yeah. And it's just, it's frustrating for the reader like me that's curious about so much, because your appetite gets stoked.
Yeah.
For all of it.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, you have the most perceptual capacity to understand the nature of what probably is happening, as far as like, if you're willing to explore that fictionally. And it's like, no one can write that fictional novel but you.
Yeah.
Which is sort of fucked. Yeah. Because it's like, that would be the coolest fictional book, is to see the guy that spent the most time.
Dante Lello did it too.
Yeah.
Novelist who wrote about the JFK assassination. Stephen King did it.
I didn't know
he
that.
He wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination, but he fictionalized it.
Sure.
And those guys, I'm like, damn them.
Yeah.
They're getting to have all the fun.
They're having the fun.
And I can't, because I got handcuffs.
You have the handcuffs.
Yeah.
Because I'm curious now, and we were talking before we started to hit record, and I've been delving into the research and curiosity about the modern psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah.
And as soon as you get into that renaissance and you see the mainstream, it's almost like a deployment at this point, where there's like big prominent magazines and big institutions, Harvard and MIT, all these guys are studying psychedelics.
Ironically, it began in Harvard. Really,
it began in Harvard.
Leary,
well, that's the thing, is it leads you back to the beginning. The formation of it ties right into the CIA, especially in the Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, so they developed the CIA. It's all about mind control. It's all about psychological manipulation and understanding.
Yeah.
And now there's this huge billion-dollar industry that's emerged in the last 25. MAPS has been around for 40 years, but it sort of went sleepy for a while.
Yeah.
And now it's got this, like, all of a sudden everyone's glorifying it, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Especially if you approach it skeptically and just go, what's really going on here? Because there's good potential in these things, obviously. They've been used for all of human history. And they change consciousness more than anything, any form of hypnosis. This is the most powerful thing on the planet to shape consciousness. And the CIA has been working for years, since we know of, for sure, from 50s to the 70s, but that shit doesn't just go away. We take all that accumulative knowledge, which you prove in your book that works, and they have actually proven that you can create psychopaths and murderers, and so then it leads into like, well, what's going on today with the movement of medicalization, and we're going to heal trauma, but you got to pay $15,000 to take MDMA, and you can take ketamine.
Is that what they're charging for MDMA?
That'll be the price for MDMA there, 10 to 15 grand. And it has to be done in this way, through the institution, through the authority.
Yeah.
Only if you check boxes for trauma, right? And it's like, well, they're taking the most vulnerable people, and you start to go into this, like, I'm curious about this.
How much experimentation is going on?
Experimentation, not only that, but also, like, if you wanted to shape consciousness on a global scale, and you wanted to make trillions of dollars while doing it, and you wanted to do the biggest research project you've ever done in the meantime. There's so many angles to it.
There's a lot of funding for,
big funding. And there's already been a lot of problems inside of the studies.
Yeah.
And there's already people pushing back and going, well, this went really bad, but then MAPS paid me off to not talk about it.
I don't know anything about that. I try to stay away.
You would be the ultimate guy to be in it, but you're not. And it's like, well, geez, you're
making me really curious. I never heard of MAPS until you mentioned it today. And I'm so scared to start looking at contemporary stuff because I'm still trying to stay, in my 60s, 70s to figure out what happened then.
And that's good work, because at the end of the day, you only have so much time and attention.
I know.
We all have to almost delegate different people to do different amounts of research.
If MAPS can clone my brain so I can do two things at once, then maybe I'll do it.
It would be perfect, because that was one of the most curious things for me, is like, well, what your thoughts were on that, but you didn't even know really about the nature of the psychedelic renaissance, which is fascinating because it all led from that.
I know.
This is the new tip of the spear element.
I see the headlines. And I don't read the story because I'm like, I don't want to, it's going to be too distracting. And then I'm going to start asking the questions you're asking, like, well, what's being done now?
Yeah.
Then I'll never get my history book done about what was done then if I start trying to figure it. My collaborator, Dan, though, is doing a real big book, as far as I know. And I think that's why he got a very substantial, great deal for it. It's the first kind of thorough study history of ketamine.
Okay.
And the ketamine revolution, from the origins of when it was created as an anesthetic. Sorry, should I?
No, it's all right. I just hear a little bit of
It's a trash guy now.
We'll just give it a pause. We'll pause. I'm sure he'll be out of here in a moment.
Yeah, it's usually a minute or two. He's at the end of the driveway.
Dumping the bins.
All my notes that I throw in there after I transcribe them.
Oh my God!
I shouldn't say that.
Your notes, man. Your book. I'm gonna have to get a photo of that before. Yeah,
you can look before you go,
because that'll be cool to add to, like, the pictures of it,
so you can see part of it.
Right after the Trump shooting and right before this tech go out. And so anyway, we're in the middle of this interesting unfolding of probably one of the biggest things that'll happen in human history.
Don't say that.
It's crazy, but. The garbage truck's gone. We were getting into the ketamine.
Oh, yeah. So I was
saying, you were saying your friend.
My collaborator, Dan Piepenbring, is doing kind of a authoritative study, actually written like my book in the first person, because he also has done personal experimenting with ketamine and taking it in various settings, clinical, also on the street with private ketamine dealers and whatnot. And it's a little late. It's supposed to be finished. He's tardy, but who am I to criticize anyone for that? But it's going to be a really, I think, exhaustive book about how ketamine came about, how it was used originally, what the intentions were, how it's used now, what's good about it, what's bad about it.
Interesting. And what was his aim for the book on ketamine? Why?
Well, he's always he's one of those kind of psychedelic drug astronauts. He's very curious about how it works. And it's really a coincidence that he ended up with me doing my book, because I got him only because Prince died. He was working as Prince's biographer with Prince. Prince was writing his memoir with Dan.
Okay.
And Dan was traveling with him for about 6 months on tour. And then there was a break, and then Prince died in Minneapolis or wherever.
Okay.
And then Dan all of a sudden couldn't finish the book because, number one, he didn't have enough material, and number two, because of what they knew was going to be a massive battle between the heirs. They had to stop giving him access to any Prince archives or material. So he had 2 years before that was resolved, and that's kind of what they predicted. So I had him for about a year and a half.
Got it.
But not because of his, he was just brought to me because he's like a genius savant. And my agents just said, this guy knows how to do this kind of thing.
Cool.
But he's always been interested in that area of,
I'd like to maybe connect with him someday, because
he's great. Yeah.
There's a book that he would love called Drugism. And I'm not sure the name of the author, but We'll make sure that he knows of this book before he gets done with this ketamine
Yeah, I'll
thing.
see him in about a week. I'm going to New York, and he's in New York. I just had a baby.
Because the ketamine history is in that book, at least part of it, and a lot of it's really dark, and it's tied to the CIA, of course.
Oh yeah. I've done it with him a couple times. You know, I try to experiment with just about everything that's not going to kill me.
Mm-hmm. But you're curious about it.
Yeah, and I don't really get it. You know, I haven't loved it the few times I've done it. He keeps saying, "Oh, you know, we'll try it another time in a different setting."
Mm-hmm.
But
and it is highly addictive. Most people don't say that.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, people don't say. In the new ketamine movement, it's like the glory drug, right? Because there's millions being made on it.
Yeah,
there's ketamine clinics popping up across the United States, and you know, there's benefit inside of the tool, but now everyone and their brother hops into the business model. Not everyone's quite. Their intentions might be good, but you know, they're not qualified to be sitting for people in a non-ordinary state. And then when you're in a suggestible hypnotic state, which is what ketamine puts you into, a disassociative setting,
right?
And now you have some doctor that's trying to make 10 grand a pop, and you don't even know who else is involved in these. There's good clinics and there's bad, just like there's good tire shops and there's good
That's kind of what his book's about. I mean, he was like casting a wide net.
Good.
He'd come out here to LA and he'd be out in the valley sometime doing it with some kind of bandit, you know, who's got this secret ketamine distributor, whatever. Then he would do it at UCLA with these renowned people, interviewing them, trying it. It's going to be a great book when he finally finishes it.
It'll be fun to interview that guy.
Yeah, I'll hook you up, because
I'm sure it doesn't just stay put with ketamine. It's a broad subject, and with that conversation, I'm very interested and curious. So anyway, there's a lot to that, and it all ties back to your work. I swear, it always starts with that 1950s, 60s era. Even Gordon Wasson. There's a guy that I interviewed named Robert Forte, and he knew Gordon Wasson. And
that name sounds familiar.
Gordon Wasson was the famous banker.
I know Gordon Wasson, but I said Forte.
Forte, he's been around since about the 80s or so. And he wrote a book called Entheogens and the Future of Religion. Wow. And he has quite a broad perspective because he knew Shasha Shulgin, the guy who created MDMA. Yeah. He knew Gordon Wasson. He was in his archives because he was going to help Gordon Wasson create like a book or something. And then in the archives, he finds out that Wasson was tied to the CIA and was sent to Mexico to get the mushroom and then to popularize the mushrooms.
In 1959 or 60, when Manson disappeared in Mexico for about a year and then got deported for reasons we've never been able to figure out.
Yeah. And then the mainstream Michael Pollan narrative, when he wrote that book, they skim over it quite quickly, and everyone just goes, "Oh, Gordon Wasson, the banker, goes to you know," and it comes back, and then all of a sudden there's Time magazine or whatever magazine, and it blows the mind of. It's like that was all orchestrated. Yeah. But why would we give psychedelics to the masses? You know, during the time when people were trying to organize voter campaigns, and there was a really organized anti-war movement going on. Yeah. So one of the methodologies that Forte presents is like it was to disrupt the organization of the anti-war movement and get everybody distracted, as if Huxley
said. So wait,
said,
Forte was writing that stuff before I did?
No, he didn't come across. He was writing more of the mainstream narrative, entheogens, but over time he goes, man, this whole thing could have been an op from the CIA, you know, from the get-go.
Yeah, I gotta.
You'll like him. He's a fascinating fella. I actually talked to him yesterday. I go, what do you want me to ask Tom? He goes, make sure you ask him what he thinks about the modern psychedelic renaissance and how that's been
used.
He's
going to be disappointed.
I know. Well, he knows that, you know, that you can only answer to the best of your ability.
Yeah.
Plus, you don't want to.
I don't want to pretend to know something I know nothing about.
Yeah, I'm more curious because it's obviously being somewhat orchestrated in a quite sophisticated manner. And his take on Rick Doblin and maps and that whole thing is quite interesting. But so the history of psychedelics is really all tied to this Manson stuff. And that's the reason I'm sitting here, is because I'm like, this is probably the coolest story in American history. But yeah, anyway, let me see what I got here, because I think what's going to end up happening is that you and I jumped into all this stuff and we gave no context to the fact that, you know, you wrote a book called Chaos, but there's so many podcasts. I think that you need to go through the prerequisites to get to this stage of the conversation.
Yeah, I hate to tell people that they've got to do homework before, but
that's the way it's got to be at some point.
I guess, yeah. I mean, it's amazing. Sometimes I'll be out somewhere and someone will learn about my book but haven't read it. And if they ask me about it, I'm like, oh, you don't want to hear it because I've got to explain. But, you know, people are open to hearing stuff and learning, and then they go off and do their own research, which hopefully happens from something like this.
Totally. I think it sparked a lot of different people down different avenues, and you're going to see
Mm-hmm.
a lot of different films and books
Mm-hmm.
written with yours as like somewhat of a base.
Maybe.
And just John Mark's too. I mean, his is almost a prerequisite.
Oh yeah. That's really the first one that was done, and I don't know. Is it hard to get? Is it?
I bought it quite easy.
Was it used or new or?
I think I bought it used.
Yeah.
And then I also listened to it on audio, which is a pretty good version of it.
So I didn't know they made an audio book. I wonder. I'm going to check after, because that had to have been recent. He doesn't read it himself, does he?
No.
Yeah.
I wish. Yeah. I actually emailed him, and he's like, I want to stay away from that subject matter.
So how long ago was that?
Probably a month and a half ago.
Because I can't remember if it's in the main body of my book or in the end notes, because a lot of stuff I cheated. If we couldn't fix it into the main narrative, I'll put it in the end notes. So if you've only listened to the audio book, fine. But if you want, to see the extra information, which isn't in the audio book, you've got to get the paperback, or the hardcover's impossible to get, but the paperback, because the end notes all have anecdotes and stuff.
Okay.
And he said the same thing to me. I contacted him in 2000 or 2001. And he said, I don't talk about the subject anymore. He said, you have no idea how, he didn't use the word ruin my life, but impacted my life. And I said, but I've got these letters between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb that nobody's seen. And West didn't mean to leave them in his archive. And I found them.
Jeez.
And I want to bring them to you to look at them. He said, all right, I'll meet you. It has to be tomorrow night at 11:30 at night.
Wow.
At his Georgetown townhouse. And it was the night before Thanksgiving, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I did happen to be there because my family was there. So I went there at 11 or 11:30, and he literally opens the door and goes, where is it? He didn't even say, hi, nice to meet you. And I said, he's eccentric. And he was probably in his 70s then, or maybe 60s. Wow. And I just handed him the letters, and he sat down in his dining room, and the table was like 15 pages, and he goes, I've never seen anything like this. This is the only unredacted record of MK Ultra I've ever seen.
Wow.
And he said, this letter here, the very first one, 1953, it's like 12 pages. This is a blueprint by Jolly West for the entire program.
Oh my God.
This was the original plan, and I've never seen it without redactions.
Wow.
And he said to me, he goes, if you publish this and you do this book, what happened to me is going to happen to you. And I said, what's that? He said, people start camping out in front of your house. They believe that you're the person that can validate that they were subjects of this. Yeah. Luckily, knock on wood, nobody's come to my house that I know of. But I get, emails and calls, almost not calls because I'm not listed, but there have been a few that got the phone number, but emails.
And are you allowed to print those documents or like share them with the public?
Oh yeah. There, I think a couple pages are scanned and in the book.
Okay.
But if they're not, they're actually on my social media.
Oh, cool. And going back on your Instagram.
Yeah. And in fact, I don't want to exploit what happened in Pennsylvania last Saturday, but there have been so many questions about what might have happened in that guy's head that shot at Trump. And
and you heard he was in a BlackRock commercial.
Yeah, I did.
Fascinating.
I heard that. And
you're like, geez, what in the hell?
But I still, you
don't want to go there. I
don't want to go there. I don't have enough information. I don't have the time. I thought, just so people know what was available to the government in the 1950s.
Right.
So I call it, I wrote in the very first post where I have a little video pulling quotes out of the document that Marx looked at. I said, re-upping for no particular reason. And so I've done 3 posts over the last 3 or 4 days on my Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook of these letters that John Marx looked at.
Well, when he got shot the other day, I'm like, I'm going to hang out with you. And you're the guy that has created the blueprint. Not created it, but you've sort of revealed the blueprint, like you said, Jolly West.
Marx did,
but you brought.
I got a little more.
You got more teeth in it, and you digested it a little bit more.
I got lucky,
Yeah.
And I said, he goes, "How did you know that those letters were in his archive?" I said, "I had no idea, but when I found out that he had just died and UCLA had, I think they told me 200 boxes." of papers, I thought maybe I'll be lucky. And it was horrible, having to go back to that basement of that library every day for months until it was the old needle in the haystack story. But then I found it, and it was like a revelation. I was so happy.
How did you do you get obsessive with things before this? Like, is that how your mind works? Because you're like the perfect candidate for this because you didn't get distracted. And to drive yourself for 20 years being a fireman, sometimes I'm like, all right, this chapter's coming to an end, and I'm grateful for the chapter, but what drives you is like a whole bunch of existential things on the base.
Yeah.
And for you, it's like pure curiosity.
Yeah. Curiosity, but there's some other weird psychological shit there too. I'm probably working out stuff from my history because a lot of people wouldn't have made the choice. And it wasn't a choice. I started and then I couldn't stop. And I had to finish. My parents were so supportive and fantastic. And when I got broke and started getting sued and getting evicted, they were loaning me money. And they said, never stop if you truly believe in it, but also know, and I think it's in the book, that if you do stop, it's fine. Just do whatever you think is best for your health.
Yeah. But for you, it meant so much to finish.
Yeah. If I hadn't finished, it would have been
drove you insane.
A tragedy.
You would have regretted
a personal
more.
Tragedy for me, not for anyone else. But I wouldn't have been able to get up in the morning if I had spent all that time and energy and didn't have anything to show for it. That was.
And there was times where it almost happened, right?
A lot of times. Oh my God!
God, what a crisis moments! Like that's the hero's journey for you. Is like, geez, how do you manage your life and not get depressed or get into nihilistic forms of thinking when you're like, geez, I put my whole life's energy into this.
There was a lot of dark times where I would think, why have I done? What have I done? Why have I made this choice? Nothing's going to come of it.
Yeah,
and I have it in the book, but I ended up. One way to kind of find solace was I knew I had a bunch of important discoveries. I just didn't know how they all connected. And I made a list of like 10 or 15 of them bullet points. And I carried it in my pocket wherever I went. And whenever I would have like I'd be with friends out socializing, and all of a sudden I'd start obsessing about what a waste and not paying attention.
Yeah.
Then I'd pull it out and I go, no, wait, I found this out, that out, and the other thing. It's fine.
You're on the brink of schizophrenia. It's like at some point that's what
when I sold the book 2005, 6 years in, I told one of my best friends then, Daisy, and she goes, your mother will kill me if you tell her I told you this, but she called me like 2 years ago because they thought you were losing your mind.
Sure.
And they wanted to know, because I saw you the most, if I thought you were okay. And she goes, I told them you were, and they believed me, but I kind of wasn't sure.
Yeah. And then you describe your apartment at the time, and like you said, someone comes over and they're like, you looked like a freaking madman, right?
I know, yeah.
And you had to be. In order to pin all this shit together. It's like, what other dude would have done it? Thank God you somehow it's just sort of divine.
It's good I climbed out of it, because right now you're depressing the hell out of me.
No, I mean,
you're good at bringing me back. You're good at bringing me back.
We're going to bring you back to like,
that.
Thank God for this.
And that's like, maybe I need to do some PSTD stuff, because it wasn't like a year. It was like fucking 12, 13 years where it was just, I was running and just chasing my tail.
Yeah.
And not stopping. And I thought I should stop. I was missing.
And then when you wrote the book and it was in your hand and you thought, what was it that you felt let down about? Because you probably thought this is going to shake the shingles on the whole system.
Well, no, I never was that optimistic.
No. Okay.
I mean, I was optimistic in that I knew I had to believe that I could sell it.
Yeah.
But once it was done, all I cared about was that it was something malleable, something you could hold. That was all my reporting. And I thought, now I can
let it be.
I can get run over by a bus.
Okay.
And I'll be fine, because at least there's something that's going to
outlast you.
Yeah. And I didn't know. I had no idea how it was going to sell, or if it was going to sell.
I thought maybe there was a great letdown of like, this is going to make people be held accountable.
Oh, no. Yeah. No, there was. No, what you're saying now. Yeah. There was a huge letdown, because I did think that people from the mainstream media, especially in Los Angeles, where so much of this stuff happened, in Oklahoma, where Charlie West did most of his research, in Texas prior, and in San Francisco, where I thought those local journalists are going to take my book and then go to the people that are still alive, a lot of them who wouldn't talk to me, who witnessed or who have information, and get that stuff and report it in their papers.
Sure.
And none of that happened.
Crazy.
And that was, then I thought, oh, you're just really grandiose to think that, how naive of me and stupid. And then I kind of thought, it doesn't matter. I don't care. The book's there. Maybe in 10 years someone will.
And
but no, that was a big letdown.
And now we live in an information age where before smartphones and distractibility, where you have news cycles and and there's crazy shit happening every 8 minutes. That's probably part of the element that kept people from being like, this is a huge deal.
Yeah.
Versus like now it's like we find out something wild and crazy and we move on.
Yeah.
And it's already like you have to just move on. It's almost like let it go.
Too much information.
And especially the new generation, they're sort of indulgent in it.
Well, that's why, like, when I woke up this morning and heard about this internet, attack or crash or whatever, I mean, I naively, even though I use it every day for my own research, it's also, I understand how dangerous it is and how much misinformation is on there.
Yeah.
And I know the first 5 years of doing the book were so much harder because those papers weren't scanned into digitized, and I had to go to that damn library and go to microfilm, and it was just so time consuming and tedious, and get books out from the library, and I couldn't afford to buy them. The Los Angeles Public Library, I should leave them in my will because they let me, they had a limit of like, I think 5-7 books, but my local library branch in Venice, they were great. I got to like 30-40 books that they let me max out because they knew that I was serious, and I had to keep a master list on a calendar because I didn't want to incur fines. So I'd have to renew or return, and sometimes if you return the book or tried to renew it, but you'd maxed out the renewals and someone's waiting. But the guy there would sometimes say, I'll give you an extra. You won't tell them. Yeah.
That's amazing.
But when I hear that, the internet's gone down, I sometimes think, oh my God, it would be great. I had a great childhood, and I'm sure you did too. Maybe I can't remember how you're 43.
It's like certain parts would be great, except everything's tied to it. It's almost like a stroke in a human mind.
Well, it's like the planes and the TV and everything.
Getting money, phones, food, it's like everything.
But when you think, I mean, it breaks my heart when I see kids 7-8 years old who aren't paying attention to each other. I hate myself when I go into a bar alone if I'm meeting friends and I get there early, and instead of talking to a stranger next to me, we're all on our damn phones.
Yeah, I make it an effort to my best ability to still be, because I'm from a generation where we didn't have it either. I didn't have a cell phone, even a basic cell phone, until I was 21, thank God. So I didn't have this dopamine nation of attention wars.
I have a friend who's a bartender in New York who just had a piece published in Newsweek. He's such a good friend. His name is just completely escaping. He's an Irish guy, and he wrote a great piece about, he's scolding people who come to his bar for using their phones.
It's ridiculous.
And not just using the phones, but asking him to take their picture and he just said it's ruined the whole experience of what bars were created for. And he couldn't get it published at first because I think it was too angry. But luckily he did. It came out a couple of weeks ago. I'll tell you his name. I mean, he's so insulting to him. He's the greatest guy, and I'm just blanking.
And then I think in the near future, there's going to be a real thirst and market for unplugged zones, like bars that have no Wi-Fi, and you check your phone in, you get a little key, and you keep it, and then at the end you grab your phone, or it's just going to be like a smoking thing or a racist thing where like there's a cultural disgust factor. And like the newer generation might be disgusted by the older one, and they go, you know what, when you're out in public, look at those idiots on their phones. Hopefully.
Maybe,
you never know. Because at this point it is the attention war, and it's mostly for profit. And it's very powerful. They can tap into your brainstem and basically hijack you.
I have an Instagram page where I put stuff up hoping it'll generate more interest in people who'll buy the book. So I'm guilty of using it too.
And I'll send you some good stuff for that, because that's where it can be used for good. It's more just like when it takes over and it hijacks you, and you're in that zone, because you get off of it and you're almost like, where was I?
I know, you lose time.
Imagine these young kids with that.
I know.
So they don't have the ability to have a pullback.
Yeah, and the guy that shot Trump didn't have any social media, they said.
Yeah.
How's that? He's 20 years old.
Yeah, was he being groomed? We don't know the story yet.
Yeah.
It seemed a little too obvious when like Tim Kennedy broke it down. He was an ex-sniper, special forces guy, very intelligent, and he has a spot or a Instagram, and he went through maybe 10 or 15 minutes at least with a whiteboard and goes, "Here's the thing."
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, it's worth looking at.
It's another rabbit hole.
And it's a fun one because he's very logical and grounded. He's not a conspiracy guy, but he goes, this is just crazy, and he breaks down the whole shooting already, and you're like, this is wild, man.
Wow.
And it's so in your face, but we're going to see a lot more of that coming.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Don't say that.
Well, it's unfortunate, but I don't get worried about it. I have this interesting connection to like the ancestors. You know, you start to remember like, all right, we've been through a lot.
Yeah.
We are connected to all of human history. And here we are now, and then we're going to be dead. And you could be more worried about driving up the street and getting hit in a car accident than you could of global chaos.
Right.
So we don't go into fear every time we get in our car.
Right.
And I think of it as the same thing. We just surrender and trust that all of it's working now, and it's not going to work forever, and we're all going to be dead soon.
I need that serenity.
Well, and believe me, the things, those tools that have been used for manipulation can be very powerful tools for helping to surrender in the right context, in the right setting, in the right time. And breath work is something that I discovered that helped most with that. You probably found the holotropic with Stan Grof. He was doing the research on LSD in the 1950s.
I don't know about that.
It's all tied to your book, but Stan Grof, he's like the famous psychoanalyst that created like transpersonal psychology, was the first one using LSD for experimentation on patients, psychotherapy, and having hundreds of patients. But he was getting it from Sandoz Labs and all the CIA created LSD, Hoffman. And so when they first started giving it to the institutions, Grof was one of the big names.
How do you spell Grof?
Grof.
Okay.
And he's alive today. He's about 94. I just saw him at the last MAPS conference. And now his work is treated as this Bible for MAPS, who are distributing the psychedelics, but they've been studying them since the 1950s, right? And when they shut down all the psychedelic research because of the war on drugs, or supposedly the war on drugs, and everything went underground, Grof created this holotropic breathing. And he didn't create it. He sort of reinvented old yogic techniques of circular breathing, which gets you into a psychedelic state. And it's very profound, and it can be useful, and it's actually more advantageous because it's legal, safe, free, and effective, but you can ease your way in, ease your way out. You're not stuck on a 13-hour LSD trip.
Yeah.
So all of his psychology is built off of non-ordinary states of consciousness, but it was done through the context of legalization, breathing, not LSD. Meanwhile, they kept studying LSD, of course, underground.
Yeah.
And so now what they've learned through that, they're plugging that into the most powerful psychedelic organization called MAPS. And that's what tying into the multi-million dollars of funds that are going into prescribing psychedelics and releasing them to the public under the Grofian model.
Wow.
So it's fascinating because it ties into like, well, if you take them in this relationship to trauma, subconscious exploration and all this stuff, which there's some roots in that are beautiful, but it's also shaping you.
Why haven't you written a book?
I'm learning right now. I'm in the book with you right now. We're learning. And I have lots more to learn, and I don't even know where I'd begin. I'm not like you where I can splice it down to one thing. I'm like, this whole thing's a freaking rabbit hole. And I just love learning.
It's just your curiosity.
And I'm also curious about the nature of consciousness because it's everything.
Yeah.
And when there's people like in the 50s, like in your book, that have proven that they're using these things on the public, and you think they stopped, of course, because you're like, well, they stopped the programs. They didn't learn anything. Well, they learned quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I think that they still do this stuff. And I think there's tons of nefarious actors, and they're far more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And now they're doing it, I think, in a way of medicalization of psychedelics in a certain context. Because, like I said, pain management for did you ever get into the Oxycontin and the Sacklers?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm not in my book, but I saw the documentary.
Yeah, powerful.
And
when they did that, we want you pain free. So here's your Oxy.
Oh, right.
Well, this psychological psychedelic movement's in a same way. Like, how do we get you to be pain free in this medical model?
Right. And then keep you hooked on it.
Yeah, and that's what I think ketamine's going to be the big epidemic of the future. And next thing you know, people are taking MDMA all the time with the context of its medicine, its healing.
Yeah.
And there's a whole other side to psychedelics that go back into, to me, it's like, all right, let's get into how did the indigenous used to use it? They would be in nature, and they would be in the mystery.
It was a ritual, right?
It was a ritual, and there was more about the mystery and connecting you to nature. This is more like in a hospital setting, and you're connecting to trauma and self-indulgent healing.
Yeah.
So there's just different ways to shape people's consciousness, and I'm curious about it. Like,
Yeah.
this is one way, and there's another way, and there's many other ways. But you're only going to be allowed to do them, of course, if you pay the price and you go through this model. And I think that's going to be quite a problem.
I wonder if my Medicare covers it.
Yeah, it might. What was your favorite part of writing this book? Did you have like a favorite element to it that just made
the reporting is fun. I mean, the reporting's addictive, even though there's so many fucking roadblocks and dead ends. But when I found those papers, and I'd been there probably 2 months, almost 3 or 4 days a week, just, you have to, I didn't invent this. Robert Caro, the great biographer of Johnson and, what's his name? William Moses. He coined this: turn every page. You have to look at every single document to make sure you're not missing something. And that's what I did. And then the 2 months preceding the discovery of these letters were horrible and grueling.
Jeez.
And I really thought I got a couple more weeks and then I'm through everything, and then I'll go home and realize I wasted 2 or 3 months in the dungeon of UCLA's Charles Young Library. Then I found what I was looking for, and it was just a hunch. I just felt like something in me. I don't believe in divine providence. I don't think. I'm open-minded, but I felt like something kept sending me there. And there's nothing like that feeling of discovery and then you have to vet it, and I didn't even recognize it at first, because these letters between West and the person named Grifford, Sherman Grifford, I'm like, this sounds like MK Ultra, how they're going to, induce loyalty, change ideation, create food strays, create people who will deliver messages, then forget them. All that. It sounds exactly like it, but I don't know who Sherman Griffith is, but it sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And this is where John Marks comes into play. So when you're in these archives, special collections, you have to handle everything with gloves. There's cameras on you. There's 12 people at the room, and there's a monitor. And then whatever you want print copied, you kind of flag, and then they look at it, and then they take it away, and then they copy it and they bring it to you. I thought, if this is MK Ultra documents and they realize what they are, they're going to take it away and not bring them back or me the copies. So instead of, first I took tons of notes before, in case I was not going to get them. Then I gave them to probably a graduate student who worked in archival whatever at UCLA. And then at the end of the day, when I was finished, I go and they're like, all right, here are your printouts. And they had scanned them. Then I got home and I still wasn't sure what I had. And I went to the only book I had, Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and I went to the index because I thought I'd heard the name Grifford. And then in the index, there's one reference to Sherman Grifford. And then you go to the page, and it's actually an asterisk at the bottom of the page, and it says Sherman Grifford was the alias that Sidney Gottlieb used when he was communicating with outside researchers.
Okay.
And I was like, Gottlieb, it did. And then I was like, that was as sad as my life is. It was one of the happiest moments of my life because it proved that my gut was right.
Yeah.
And I hadn't wasted 2 months. Then I kept going back and I found more correspondence.
Cool.
And now there are people going there all the time and they're finding stuff. Not a lot, but there have been a couple new letters. And I actually got a call. This is insane. One of the researchers, because people want to know where the exact location of the originals are, and I tell them, but they've been rearranging the collection. I think I have the latest version. Now I'm probably going to get lots of emails asking, but I should just put it on my website. But somebody went in there and told them that I had directed, and they said, oh, Tom O'Neill, can we have his information? So they contacted me, the head of the archives, and I haven't been there for 15 years.
Jeez.
And the people who were there when I was there, they're all gone. And they said, we'd love to create a presentation for the school based on your, research here and your book.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, it doesn't really celebrate UCLA. I'm actually critical because they never investigated West. He was the head of the psychiatry department and the neuroscience division in 1977 when his name was on the front page of the New York Times. And he was accused of having done these horrific Nazi-like experiments, and he denied it to the paper. And they never conducted their own internal investigation, or if they did, there's no record of it. And I actually was able to interview Charles Young, who that library is named after, who was a chancellor, Sherman Mellencamp, who was the head of, I can't remember now if he was the president of the university or maybe he was the head of the entire psychiatry division. And both of them said to me, when I showed them the documents showing that West had lied, I go, did you invest it? They go, no. I go, why not? And they go, well, he told us he didn't. I said, don't you understand?
Jeez.
If it's true that he's working for the CIA, they take an oath. They're not allowed to tell. You've got to. Yeah. And they said, well, we didn't. Our bad. Yeah. And then they weren't happy and they didn't want to spend any more time talking to me. They were embarrassed.
Gosh. And they're so disconnected from the roots. So it just becomes further and further away, and then it becomes amnesia.
Yeah, this was 30. I mean, this happened in West was exposed. Not that it mattered because then he lied and nobody investigated him in 77. And I was interviewing them in the early 2000s. I was just glad they were still alive to be interviewed and that they actually agreed to talk to me. Yeah, they probably didn't know what I was going to ask them about.
God, it would have been nice for you to be able to talk to Jolly West.
I did.
You did. How did that go?
Not. Yeah, it's buried in the book. Probably. I
don't think I remember
notes.
that.
No, I didn't.
Oh, it's in the notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
You got to get the print.
Because I was curious.
I think I can't remember where it is. No, I interviewed him 2 years before I got the Tate LaBianca assignment. I was free. Well, no, I wasn't. I was a contributing editor at a magazine, and I was living in New York. And they asked me to do a story on what was then this growing rash of celebrity stalker crimes.
Okay, I remember this part.
And so I came out here to LA from New York for a couple of weeks, and I interviewed people who were victimized. A couple of famous actresses who'd been, like Teresa Saldana had been stabbed, I think, 13 times by an obsessed fan. This other actress, what was her? Donna Mills, had a stalker underneath her house.
Jeez.
And a SWAT team came in and they said, you can't leave the house because he can grab you. And they had I think they killed him by shooting him.
Wow.
And Jolly West was an authority on the obsessive, violent, delusional mind.
Yeah.
So he had been identified as an expert in the phenomenon of stalking. So I went to UCLA, interviewed him for an hour. It was horrible. He was a half hour late, didn't apologize, sat down and goes, what do you want to know? I said, well, I want to, and then he just lectured and I'd stop him to ask a question and he was on automatic pilot.
Okay.
And he was just rude. It was nothing personal, I don't think. I just think I don't know. He was a jerk.
Yeah.
I never transcribed the tape. I think I make a reference to him in the story, but I don't quote him. And then 2-3 years later, all of a sudden his name pops up when I'm doing this other thing. I'm living here and doing this story about them. And I'm like, oh my God, I interviewed this guy who now I'm wondering if maybe he had something to do with the creation of Manson.
And Jack Ruby.
So I immediately look him up. He had died about a half a year before. And then once I thought there was a real good possibility that he was involved in what happened to Manson in 67, then I contacted UCLA and I said, West was there the last 30 years of his career. When he died, he was professor emeritus. Did he donate his papers? And Charlotte Young, the head of the archive, said, yeah, we've got like 150, 200 boxes, but they haven't been processed.
Jeez.
I said, well, how long does that take? She goes, it could take a couple of years.
Oh my God.
I said, I'm doing this. It was a magazine story. And I said, I have a deadline, which I had already blown for 2 years, but I was still getting paid. It was like a year and a half in. And she said, you know what I'll do? I guess she just decided to be nice, probably to her later regret. She goes, I'll have a couple box processed at a time. So you don't have to wait for the entire collection. What are you most interested in? Wow. I said, anything to do with pre-1975.
Okay.
So they started releasing a few boxes a week.
Dang.
And I still haven't been through the whole collection because I stopped about a year or two. I go back periodically, but then I thought there's not going to be anything more. But they've released stuff subsequently, and now I'm leaving it to other people because they do go in there all the time. I know that they write to me first. And I said, look, and they've been sharing stuff with me that they found. Nothing explosive, nothing like a report of him, seeing Charles Manson, and treating him.
Because you could never prove that.
No, I can't.
Even though they're in this tiny clinic and he's there hundreds of times.
Yeah, and everybody who was there said, we all encountered Manson. I mean, Jolly's associate, James Allen, who was a psychiatrist who he brought from Oklahoma to work at the clinic and in his project and the hate in 67 with him said, we saw Charlie every day. Charlie had a nickname for me. I mean, of course, Charlie knew him.
Yeah.
But, I could never place them in the same room together. And I was wondering, maybe there is a document in there where he writes his observations or records a conversation with him or says, I hypnotized him and told him to go out.
Yeah, you want that so bad.
Yeah.
Everyone does. But
yeah, you can't have everything.
that guy had to feel weird being around him, like a psychopath, right? I mean, he's obviously creepy.
Well, at that point, he was a curiosity. So this is 67. Manson's coming to the clinic with the girls.
Yeah.
He had about 4 or 5 or 6 young women followers, but they were completely subservient to him at that point.
But I mean, Jolly himself.
Oh, what he was like.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I
Jolly,
definitely think he was a
sociopath.
A sociopath, yeah.
And you could feel when you're with him, he's just so disconnected.
Well, yeah, I have a lot of anecdotal stuff that didn't end up in the book because it didn't feel
like it was useful enough.
Well, it was useful. Maybe I'll put in the second one. I mean, his closest assistant who worked with him for 10 years went to Oklahoma. I mean, was a grad student in Oklahoma, studied under him, then graduated and became his research assistant. And then when West moved out here to UCLA in 69, he brought him Bud Addis.
Okay.
And Bud Addis's wife, Marcia, out here. And then Bud Addis finds 5 or 6 years after her, the reason he brought me was he's fucking my wife.
Oh, my God.
Marcia.
Yeah.
I could be sued for this, but I don't care. It's not in the book. She wouldn't talk to me. She's a very high level person in her field, unless she's passed away. I hope she hasn't. But Bud Addis said he's a sociopath. He's one of the most, I mean, of course, he was fucking my wife and he was my boss and he was her boss too.
And a total manipulator of.
He goes, but he was fucking everybody's wife.
Wow.
And he was manipulating people. He was a horrible human being.
Man.
And I have that from a lot of people, that worked with West.
God, he had
a benevolent. One of them called him a benevolent sociopath. I said, "Isn't that kind of an oxymoron?"
Yeah.
And they said that was what was so amazing about West.
Yeah.
Is you would think he was a grandfather Santa Claus kind of guy with his beard, but he was dangerous.
God, it's to the degree that most people in this conversation aren't going to get the nuts and bolts of, but in the book and in even Rogan's interview.
I hate to say it, they got to read the book.
This is it feels like our conversation too is definitely going to have a disclaimer that says prerequisite involved because we just, it's great because that's what I was curious about is like, if you want to even get into our conversation, you're going to have to go and do your own stuff. Because I'm more like, what wasn't in the book and who were these people and what the hell drove you? And there's so much more to it, you know?
Yeah.
But to me, the book is such a cliffhanger, and it's like, whew. But I'm fascinated with this Jolly West character and those hippie houses and everything and what they were doing.
The crash pad. The laboratory described as a crash pad is what he called it in The Hate in 1967.
Yeah, and getting people to the students at the time, like they were doing it through the university.
Yeah,
and the university knew that this was going on. It's like unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah.
So you wonder.
He said to them before they went, "Grow your hair long, and don't bathe, because you need to blend in to recruit people from the streets into our laboratory," where they were giving them drugs, and then observing them.
Yeah. And the university knew, do you think, to the detail that these students were being...
Well, this was Oklahoma at the time. This was 67, so he brought grad students from Oklahoma to The Hate for that summer. And then he hired some local, probably grad students from University of San Francisco and stuff. But I have no idea. I doubt that they had they didn't. I found a few of them and interviewed them.
Oh, cool.
And I quote one of them who I couldn't find. And then I found out she was long dead, Kathy Collins. Was it Collins with a C or Collins with a K or Kathy with a C? That's why I couldn't find her. And then when I did, she was dead. She has diary entries because he wanted them to keep journals while she was working in this laboratory disguised as a crash pad. And she says, "Who is Jolly West? Why does he have us here? What is he doing? I feel like this whole thing is a front for something else.
Yeah.
He brings in these people who all have military bearing, doesn't tell us who they are. Why are we here?" And she was so frustrated. And those journal entries are in UCLA. I have them all mimeographed here, but I quote them hopefully in the main part of the book. Maybe more of it's in the end notes.
Yeah.
But the people who were in the project didn't know.
Yeah.
And that was what the CIA did. They compartmentalized stuff.
Yeah.
They would give people tasks and not tell them
what it was tied to.
Yeah, yeah.
that seems like how the CIA's worked from the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It was like this big, I think Hunter S. Thompson had a quote, it's like a mansion with millions of rooms or something.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that.
I forget the quote exactly. It's like
good.
that. And it's like, it's not some one thing.
Yeah.
It's a complex organism that from the beginning was created in that decentralized pattern. And to this day, it's like, it's probably the most sophisticated, crazy thing we could never wrap our head around. No one could. I don't even think the people in the institutions could ever even conceive of what they're a part of.
Well, the head of the CIA at the time of the Kennedy assassination, Allen Dulles, was fired by Kennedy like a year before the assassination, or half a year.
And he's a huge character.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like,
he's the puppet master. But the guy that took his place, I don't know if it was Colby or someone, when he found out that MKUltra existed under his watch, and I believe him, and I could have the wrong director, but it was one of 2 or 3 transitional ones. He said, they didn't tell me about it because it was so illegal, and they knew that they couldn't tell me because I would have ended it.
Yeah.
But they were still able to operate while he was running it.
And Kennedy wanted to end it and smash it into a billion pieces.
Oh, yeah, that might have been why.
Why did they kill him?
One of the reasons, probably, yeah. And then how Allen Dulles became, the guy right under Earl Warren on the Warren Commission. And then Richard Helms, who created MKUltra on Allen Dulles' orders in 1949-50, was the liaison between the Warren Commission and the CIA. He eventually became the director, but then he was like the assistant. The whole thing was, set up and fraudulent, the Warren Commission from the start.
Right. Yeah, and the development of the CIA, are you pretty sophisticated on explaining the overarching Cliff Note story of that from the late 40s to
from OSS?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't go into it too much in the book because, again, what was important to me, and it's only a footnote in the book, was Evel Younger, who was a district attorney of Los Angeles who oversaw, the choice of Vince Bugliosi to prosecute this case in a very dishonest way, had come out of the OSS.
Okay.
And he was in the FBI. And then when World War II happened, OSS, Office of Strategic Services, was our, overseas spying service, which I guess we needed.
Yeah.
You need to know what the enemy's doing. So they would, they would infiltrate the enemy lines and stuff. That's how they gathered you were talking about Paperclip, the Nazi scientists who they didn't want the Russians to have that technology. Yeah. So they would bring over whoever the Russians couldn't.
And I've heard thousands.
I guess. I mean, Annie Jacobson, who's now a friend of mine, wrote a great book called Operation Paperclip about the whole history of it.
I'd like to read that.
Yeah, it's great. But Younger went from the FBI. World War II happens. He's over in the OSS with Richard Helms, OSS, Allen Dulles. They're all there. And then when the war ends, he comes back here. And then I think he went to law school and then became a deputy DA and then took over the DA's office. And then, when Nixon got elected, inaugurated in early '69, he was part of Nixon's crime force. And, whatever.
Crazy.
I mean, I need to do more on Evel Younger and the OSS. But yeah, it was the OSS birthed the CIA when they no longer, the CIA is not allowed to operate domestically. Right. And MKUltra was 90% domestic experimental program. It was completely illegal on many, broke every Hippocratic law.
And it makes you think we're in a Third Reich or a Fourth Reich. After you're like, okay, this whole thing, the communist war never ended. It became this psychological war.
Right.
And that's where it developed, was from the CIA.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the piece that got me most curious about that part of history, because you're like, this is the pivotal moment of, like, the military industrial complex and the funding of wars, and we can keep this machine going all the time by getting people to feel patriotic, or you can manipulate the masses at whatever. If you're playing chess, the devil's chessboard.
Oh, David Talbot.
Yeah.
He's unfortunately he had a pretty bad stroke a month or two ago, and I'm not sure he's able to communicate.
Oh, wow.
But I was up in San Francisco about 2 weeks ago, and I wanted to see him. I've never met him, but he and I share an agent, and we've communicated a lot by email and stuff, but I don't think he's in good shape. But what you're talking about, the devil's chessboard, is about Dulles. And, he thinks that Dulles, and I think he's probably right, engineered the whole Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
he wrote a book before that called Brothers about the assassinations of Robert and John Kennedy that also implicates Dulles.
Good book.
Oh yeah, they're really good books.
Nice. I'm going to put all this in the show notes to make it easy for people to
Yeah,
go.
good. He and I disagree about David Smith, who's the head of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, because he wrote a book called Season of the Witch, which is about 1967 and the Haight. And this is kind of an inside baseball story. But when Penguin Press canceled my deal in 2012, they were my first publisher for 7 years, and they pulled the plug and sued me. But right before they did that, they said, all right, maybe if he can get a collaborator and he can crank it out real quick, we'll give him another chance. So David, since he was also with my agent, was interested, and he read my proposal that I had sold to Penguin Press, which was book length.
Oh, man.
And he said, I can't work on this book because he's got David Smith as a bad guy. And in my book that's coming out in 6 months, Season of the Witch, he's a hero because he started this clinic that helped all these runaways. And I'm like, yeah, well, David, you evolve. You got new information, because I wanted him to collaborate with me. But, I don't blame him. He said, I can't do it because it completely contradicts
his story,
my presentation of him. And it wouldn't make David look bad. But, how would he know any of this? Because he wasn't looking.
And how did he feel when you talked to him about this conflict of story?
That's what we never really had. We had a couple emails. We never had a conversation about it, which is what I regret. I wanted to wait till I was up there again and especially see what he thought about my book. So when I went 2 weeks ago, I didn't go to see him, but I went to interview David Smith, and a family friend had died, so I had to go to a funeral. But he had just had his stroke a week before, and I got in touch with my agent right before I went. I go, is he any better, do you know?
Dang.
And my agent's, and then I went to his Facebook page, and I think he's in a coma. I'm not sure. I shouldn't say anything, but I don't think he's, so I never got to meet him face to face.
Yeah. When you interview folks, did you just go pen and paper, and how was your methodology?
I almost always had a little recorder with me, sometimes two, because I would never trust. I'm horrible with technology. And I mean, in the book, I write about Vince, because Vince Bugliosi ironically did the same thing.
You guys didn't know which one was on and off.
I knew, he didn't. So I had my two, and he had his two, and he wanted to go off the record all the time, usually to threaten me. And he said, I turn the recorders off. And I go, Vince, yours is still on. He goes, oh, which? And I go, no, you turn it off, but now you turned it back on. And, it was ridiculous. And then at one point in the interview, I said, I'm not turning the recorder off anymore because you're going to threaten me. And if you want to keep threatening me, then do it on tape. Be a man about it. Don't do it off the record.
God, he had to be what a wild character to deal with.
Yeah.
You did a nice job describing that in the Rogan interview. That was one of my favorite parts. I was like, man, you really went. You didn't? You should listen to that.
I can't listen to me talking about. I won't listen. I'm sorry, but I haven't
listened to a
single podcast I've done.
Because that was a good recollection of your time with him.
Really?
And it was really well done, and just it was well extracted.
And now I'm curious.
You should at least listen to that piece.
Okay, maybe. I don't know where it is in the thing.
That's funny. That's great. You just move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't like the sound of my own voice. And this is a good one, though. You're asking good stuff.
And I'm curious about Charles Manson to you. Who do you think he is now? I mean, what do you think what's going on with this guy? I mean, at the end of the day, you wrote a lot about him. You spent 20 years of your life. It was supposed to be about him, but it led into all the rabbit holes of what the CIA was capable of. And that just was the centerpiece that got you hooked. But I'm like, who is Charles Manson?
That's one of the most frustrating things. I still am not sure what he was conscious of and what he wasn't. I mean, I tell the story in the book, and it's so frustrating because anybody who's seen interviews with Manson on camera knows the games he plays with whoever's interviewing him.
Yeah.
Whatever poor sucker, whether it's Geraldo Rivera, Diane Sawyer, Tom Snyder. He dances and plays and puts on a show, but at least they got him on camera and face to face. When I interviewed him, he wasn't allowed to have visitors because he was in the hole, which is, solitary for bad behavior. So that was 2000, I think. And he was allowed, I think, one night a week to do phone calls to come out of the hole. So my interviews with him, 2 or 3 or 4 of them were all on the telephone, and he was doing the same bullshit.
Yeah.
Then about 7 or 8 years later, I went back to see whether or not I could interview him again, and I found out he was out of the hole and I could go see him, But long story short, he found out the direction my book had taken, and he got really angry and upset, and through the conduit started threatening me, which didn't scare me at all. But I lost access, so I never got to sit down. Not that I could have done actually Tom Snyder's a good journalist. Geraldo was pretty good back then. Diane's, not that I could have gotten stuff from him that they didn't, but I actually had new stuff that he had never been confronted with. So the answer to your question.
And why do you think what element of him and the book were at conflict?
Well, so he, in his parole hearings, he would release information that was never followed up on by the parole officers, and that's not their job. They're not to investigate. They're just to decide whether or not a person's rehabilitated. He never wanted to get out. They knew that. He stopped going, actually. But in the parole hearing starting in 98, 99, till the last one in the early 2000s, in like 3 or 4 different ones, he said that when he got out of prison in 67, he had carte blanche to do what he wanted to do because the federal government was protecting him.
Wow. Amazing.
Was that true? Was he doing that for entertainment purposes at the parole hearing? It was just weird. And then he also said that he was talking about naval doctors that were coming to see him before he was released in prison at Terminal Island that he didn't trust, and that they tampered with him. So all of that stuff could be, but he would also say things like he said to me that the key you're looking for is buried underneath Red Skelton's house in Malibu, and it unlocks doors, stays something. I mean, all this mumbo. Am I supposed to
actually go
there? Are these
there?
clues? Or, I mean, you could lose your mind.
Sure.
So, one thing that's also in the book was at one point he and I had a big argument, and he had a guy next to him at the payphone called
so you're on phone.
I'm on the phone and he's on the phone in prison.
Yeah. Are you looking at him through glass?
Oh, no. Phone.
This is
telephone.
But I thought, how they have phones in prison.
Oh, yeah, no.
I wasn't.
He wasn't allowed.
Okay. Originally, that's what I thought. And I was like, maybe you're saying right here in front of the glass.
Oh, no, I even wish.
Yeah.
No, I was on a phone here, and he was in, where do you call it? I can't remember.
Whatever the prison is.
In Northern or Central California.
Yeah.
But at one point, he got off, and his guy, Pincushion, his kind of bodyguard in prison, and they called him Pincushion because he was stabbed so many times.
Jeez.
He gets on the phone. He's like, "You're upsetting the old man. You can't ask those questions. You can't talk to the old man like that."
Wow.
I'm like, "Just put Charlie back on." And then the third guy, who's on the outside of the walls, is named Grey Wolf. He was Manson's kind of PR guy. He was a devotee who joined Manson's group after the murders in 1970, but never stopped, He followed Manson from prison to prison, would take care of any kind of donations, selling Manson's art.
It's like a messiah character to him.
Yeah. And he got on the phone. He would record the phone call too. I would record it. And then one day after one of our fights, he calls me up and he goes, "You're really upsetting the old man. And if you want to keep talking to him, you got to show some respect." And I said, "Gray, I'm just asking him questions that I don't think are out of line." And he said, "Listen to how he responded." After I hung up, Grey Wolf kept recording. And Charlie, I said, "Okay, I'm happy to hear what he said about me." So Charlie's on the phone saying to Grey Wolf, "I don't know why Tom's putting me in this kind of jeopardy with these questions because there's no statute of limitations." And all of a sudden he sounded like a lawyer.
Yeah.
I'm like, "Hey,
how interesting.
You just blew the
cover.
Your cover."
Yeah.
He's coherent here.
Sure.
Not when I talk to him. So the whole thing's an act. And Wolf's like, "Oh, shit, I shouldn't have played that for you."
How interesting. So he's able to switch in and out of these personality types.
He's dead now, but yeah. So it's a mystery.
Very, very intelligent, obviously, guy, but geez, very complex character.
He was really, really bright, but not book smart.
Right.
He had, I think, a 5th or 6th grade education. He was barely literate. But who knows? Again, who knows what was true about even that? We don't know what he...
And how much was manufactured from Jolly and geez, there's so much manipulation too and cultivation of this charismatic character that you're like, okay, that might have been part of the CIA's experimentation of MK Ultra, right? Is to create this charismatic.
It's the might-haves that make you crazy.
Yeah.
That was, when I started thinking about stuff like that.
Because even Oso and those guys, you wonder how much, because in the same time frames, you're like, these are charismatic people that are tied to big, powerful institutions, and they're deploying, they would give people MDMA to raise money.
Wait, who's Osu?
Osu was the Wild Wild Country documentary.
Oh, of
the
course,
Guru.
I love them.
Fascinating,
Yeah,
right?
I actually met one of the guys who directed one of the episodes or something.
Oh, that was a great film.
Oh yeah, it was amazing. I can't believe how long ago it was.
That's what we need for yours, is that type of setting.
Tell me about it.
That same director should pick this up.
Too late.
Yeah.
I wish. Maybe the next round.
But he was dosing his investors with MDMA, supposedly. Yeah. Well, guess what Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS, does?
What?
From what I've heard in this recent article, MAPS is a psychedelic cult. Fascinating article. You should read it. Is that brings these investors to these banquets. They all do MDMA, of course, because they're having a nice time. And in their post-glow phase, the next morning calls them up. Hey, so are you ready to invest in our...
really?
So you're hit, and they know this from the 1950s.
Wow.
Yeah, you get into the deep
I want to see that article.
And you go into the modern psychedelic
Don't
renaissance.
Send me down a rabbit hole, but I want to read that.
I'm not trying, but
article.
I know you would love it. It's just such a fun subject, man.
Yeah.
And it's like this industry never went away. Mm-hmm. It's here now today more than ever, and the people involved are more sophisticated and they're less obvious, and it's fascinating.
Yeah,
and I'm like, okay, this is a fun subject. Fun. But Charlie is just such a fascinating thing. And
don't invest as much of your life in it as I do.
No,
you're good because you move.
I move on
episode to episode.
Yeah, and I'm also like it's a good curiosity. But I'm curious about literally everything.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a generalist.
Yeah.
Whereas like I can go down the rabbit hole and get into like Feynman's work or, you know, I like everything.
Yeah.
I talked to an ethnobotanist the other day that studied plants and wrote books about the desert.
I'm embarrassingly narrow now.
Well, I love people like that because the specialists.
I know so little about so much else that I should know about. Just because I feel like if I start, like I said, I read the headlines and don't read the stories because I'm like, I have to keep working on this other stuff. It's still, unfortunately, for better or worse, just as obsessive. I mean, I was working until you just came over here this morning.
It's amazing. And what is your next book's premise, or what is it going to be?
It's just a continuation of what I found in the first, and what I wasn't able to figure out is hopefully figured out. And like I said, I'm only doing it. I'm feeling closer and closer. I had a conversation with my agent about a week ago, and he's like, can you send me a bullet point list? And damn, my collaborator's been asking for that for about 2 years. And I said, if I do the bullet point list, it's gonna a couple of weeks of me making sure I'm not putting anything on there, and it's gonna stop. But it's time to do it. I'll probably do it this summer, probably.
Yeah, you're like a dot connector, and it's become like you have a matrix. If you had to make a whiteboard,
I had a whiteboard.
Do you have any photos of that time frame?
It's
in the book.
There's a picture of me in front of the whiteboard when it wasn't even that big.
Cool.
And I have it in the apartment. I think it's in a closet in my bedroom.
Yeah.
It's in the closet and it's still facing the wall because I don't want to have PTSD by looking at it. But I had to have the whiteboard. I had to. And what was funny about it wasn't this apartment. It was Venice. But once the whiteboard didn't contain things, I started putting construction paper around it.
Okay.
And then drawing on the paper to make it give me more space.
Goodness. That had to be wild time for you.
Yeah.
And then when you were young, did you know you wanted to be a writer?
No. Oh, yeah. I knew I wanted to. Well, yeah, I was always interested in storytelling. And I don't remember this. My mom told me when I became a journalist, in my kind of late 20s, I think I started getting paid for it. And I never went to journalism school or took a journalism class. But my mom told me that I loved that my teachers would always encourage me to write stories because I would write these fantastical stories. And I barely remembered that.
Wow.
And then when I went to college, I just wanted to study English and history, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I was one of those nerdy Steven Spielberg kids who had a Super 8 camera, would make movies and tell stories. And I loved, even though I only showed them to my family and friends, I loved capturing their attention, for those 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So when I had to declare a major, I actually ended up deciding I wanted to become a film director. And I was at a great school in St. Paul, Minnesota called McAllister that I love, but they had no film program. So I transferred to NYU and became a film major.
Wow.
But as soon as I got there, I found out I didn't really want to direct. I wanted to write screenplays. But then I started going to the theater, and I fell in love with the theater and live stuff. So I started writing plays.
Oh, cool.
And then the journalism thing was, I just started like I told you earlier, I drove a horse and carriage.
Yeah, it was paying the bills
for about 8 years, and to support my playwriting, which sucked.
Yeah.
And while I was on the carriage, I just started writing anecdotal stuff in the downtime, and I sent one piece into New York Magazine, and they published it.
Cool.
And then all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, that was an easy, I think, $850.
Nice.
And they said, we love your voice. Do you want to do more? And then that snowballed, and the next thing I knew, I had a career. But nothing was planned, just like this fucking book wasn't.
And
planned.
The career, that sort of led you to that little opportunity for the Manson 3-month deal that then led you to a 20-year commitment on one story, which is such a funny thing how life works like that.
I do, yeah. I mean, I always, not always, but I often wonder if I had done it, turned it around in 3 months, would I still be doing? Because it can be pretty grueling, and actually it doesn't. The industry hardly exists anymore. You know, I mean, print magazines are practically dead, and most of the people who are my contemporaries, they don't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Not just because they're older, but because they stopped getting good money for it. Once the internet exploded, and that it's insulting that the stories that I was writing 5,000-7,000 word stories. Now they write stories that are 800 words.
Yeah.
You can't get. There's no long form journalism, or there's hardly any.
And it's still, I think, a market for it, but they just don't do it.
And and where they do publish it, they don't pay.
Right.
You can't make a living.
But there are like Substacks and websites.
I know,
now
and people tell me I should do that. I don't know how to do that.
I could hook you up. I mean, it's simple. I get you set up.
Well, I actually did it. I said I don't know how to do it. I did it, and I just tried it, and immediately I must have hit a button, but emails went out to all my contacts.
Oh.
The next thing I know, people are subscribing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, no, wait, I don't have new material.
It's okay.
No, but I didn't want people paying me $10 a month and not getting anything in return. So I stopped it, and I refunded.
Just for their sake. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, they were doing it to be supportive. I go, I'm working on a book. I'm not,
But as you're writing the book, what you could do even is upload a page here and there and give people little chunks.
Well,
and
I
then
mean,
people
I do
support the book.
I actually do it for free on my social media. I make these little, like I'm working on one right now. The other stuff is old. I already made those with West. But like this great costume designer named Anthea Silber died a few weeks ago. Right before Robert Towne, who wrote Chinatown, died. They worked on everything together. She worked on Chinatown, Shampoo that Robert Towne wrote, and she did the costumes, and she gave me amazing interviews.
Cool.
Because she was very close to Sharon and Roman. And when I found out she died, I just found out last week.
Yeah.
I thought I'll do a little tribute to her. So I've cut together like a 4-minute video of images and some video of her working and stuff. And then the narration is her talking to me.
How cool.
And I do that for free on my social media, almost because I just enjoy it, even though it's very raw. I'm not a pro, and people complain and say I should hire somebody.
Well, and we could always put a donation link on your Instagram, and the people that want to donate.
I've been told to do that, but I'm like, maybe if they just buy the book. Is it easy?
Yeah. I mean, it'd be so simple. You put your freaking Venmo account on your link tree
really?
there, and boom, you get.
I don't even have a link tree.
It's easy, but beside the point, what should happen though is you should, at least for your time and energy, which would support you.
It does take a lot of time
and energy, and then people want to support you. It's nice.
Maybe I'll do that.
A person drops $1, and then 1 million people drop $1, and now you got.
I do have like 21,000 followers, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, $1 would help.
Yeah, and it makes you have more time to go do more of what people want. So.
Then they're going to expect the stuff to be more sassy and
You'd be shocked. People are happy to, like, I subscribe to Substacks, and I pay people because I love their work, and I don't care. I'm not waiting for their next thing. And when they put something out, I feel grateful.
Yeah.
So you never know.
Maybe
I'm just trying to encourage you that way, because you're part of that generation, and it's like that didn't really know how this all works.
Still doesn't.
And still doesn't. And it's like it's an incredible platform and ability to connect to people. At the end of the day, it's what you want to do. It's what this is. It's like I pretty much invest all my own time and energy, but it's because you have a cool story to share, and it's fun, and I think it's important to share and to learn.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So the new film that you're going to do, are you able to talk at all about it?
I'm not supposed to say too much about it, but by contract, we sign NDAs at Netflix. And until they announce it, I'm not allowed to even say it's happening.
Yeah.
But the director, Errol Morris, talked about it in a couple interviews he did in the fall.
Cool.
So once he did that, I thought, well, he already put it out there. So yeah, it's a film by Errol Morris for Netflix on the book, and it's coming out, I think, in the winter.
Cool.
And hopefully we'll be happy with it. We'll see.
What did you think of Wormwood? That was based on your
I
book.
became really good. Well, I hooked Errol up with Eric Olson, who's Frank Olson, the subject of Wormwood's son, who did something similar to what I've done, actually much more intensive.
Felt bad for him.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not just, he just didn't spend decades, but this is his father's murder.
Yep.
So it was much more personal. And I actually I email him. I see him when I go to Maryland, haven't for about 5 years, but he lives about an hour and a half from my sister and brother and some relatives in Maryland. So I'll try to go see him. Nicest guy in the world.
Yeah, he seems so genuine.
Yeah. So Errol did Wormwood, and
it's a proven murder, Frank Olson. That sort of.
Well, nobody's ever. I mean, all that the United States government would do is say we take responsibility, but they still claim that the responsibility was they gave him LSD without his knowledge. But what I think Errol did a good job of, and it was really based on all of Eric's reporting for years and years, it was an assassination because he was about to whistleblow.
Yep.
So they killed him.
Yeah.
They hit him over the head and threw him out the window.
Yep.
And I actually wish Errol had taken it a little further than he did. I know that Eric had more information. Sorry for saying that, Eric. But there was more evidence of it, and I hope Eric finishes the story at some point. But yeah, Errol's really good at what he does. That was really haunting, that film.
Does Eric share much more outside of that in interviews? I haven't really seen
No,
anything.
He doesn't do them. He's really, really, I mean, the reason one would happen was Errol and I were working on what we're working on again now, but we're doing this in 2014. And he came to Venice with a crew and shot me for a day or two. And during one of the interviews, I started telling the story of Frank Olson, which Errol already knew.
Yeah.
But, I knew that the viewers weren't familiar with it. And I mentioned, being friendly, because I reached out to Eric years before for research purposes, and he and I had become friends. And he said, "Oh, do you think Eric would agree to go on camera for your film?"
Yeah.
And I said, he's very reclusive now, and he doesn't like the endless regurgitation of the story without, telling the whole story, which a lot of people were apprehensive about, saying he was definitely murdered. But Eric's also very bright, went to Harvard. Errol's very bright, lives in Cambridge. And I said, he'll know who you are. So if I ask him to talk to you, I'm sure he will. Long story short, they talked, and then Errol wanted to do a story about the two of us.
Sure.
Our parallel journeys. And as much as I loved Eric, I said, that's not what I signed up for. My story is separate and his story is separate. You got to do one or the other. And that's when I walked away. And then Wormwood was birthed of it.
Interesting.
So since Wormwood came out, I don't think Eric, I think he might have done one podcast interview, but he's very upset because he was hoping, like you asked me about, would people be held accountable? He hoped that Wormwood
would do that,
would change things, but still the history books have an asterisk next to his father's name, which was given LSD by the CIA and jumped to his death.
Jeez.
Was having a nervous breakdown, and that's not true. And Eric, it just breaks his heart.
Yeah.
So he doesn't.
And that was such a good film. I thought it was well done.
Yeah. No, Errol did a great job. He could have done a greater job. And if he sees this, sorry, Errol, but he's hurt.
And I'd love to see how yours turns out, but I know that it needs like that Wild Wild Countries type setting where it's like, let's build this up. Like the Grateful Dead, they did one on Amazon Prime that was good.
I still haven't seen that, but I've heard
it's called Long Strange Trip. But that kind of series is what we need with this.
Yeah.
So hopefully someday something can emerge from it.
Right now it's a feature. Maybe Netflix will watch your podcast and say, "Oh, you know what? That never occurred to us. Let's make it a series instead." Errol's got a lot of great footage. That would be wonderful.
Oh my God, that's what I hope for in the future, because that book is fun. Your book.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones that you just don't. Nobody can do it unless the rare soul like you ends up doing the crazy work. And the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it. So it's like, geez, what a rare person to take on that assignment.
Soul. Yeah, in that case.
Well, I look forward to the future work. I always have a question that I ask everyone at the end, and it's not a dark question, but it's a truthful question.
You're
But
prefacing it with
yeah, it can be. Some people are like, well, that's dark, and it's like, well, reality is we're all going to be dead soon, right? And so I like to say, what would you want to say to the world if this was your last time speaking? Like if you were going to die this afternoon.
You're now just jinxing me.
No, I don't believe
I'm going to die this afternoon.
No, you're not, because I say it all the time to myself, and I love life. And
all right, say it again. What would
if you were going to die today, what would you want to say right now to the world or whoever listens?
You mean the world that I don't know, or my family and friends?
Let's say it to the world, like in this podcast setting.
I don't know, just that I tried to be as honest as I could. And I mean, unfortunately, the first thing I think of is my book, which I don't think is the most important part of me, but it definitely defines me. And right now, it's what will be my legacy. And even saying that, I mean, that's what Vince Bugliosi kept saying to me when he was screaming and cursing and
in the third person.
This is my legacy. Yeah, you're ruining Vince Bugliosi's legacy. So when I use that word now, I immediately think of him, like, oh God, not me too.
No.
But no, I mean, just that, I tried being as honest as possible in the telling of the story. And I actually really hope that if I died today, that people would pick up the baton and keep, follow my breadcrumbs and keep reporting it and find out the shit I couldn't find out. That would be wonderful.
Well, I think that's going to happen, because that's how knowledge works. People dig things up, and the right person takes it on. And but what would you want to say to your family and friends if you were going to?
Oh, just thanks for fucking not,
losing hope,
not institutionalizing me. I used to joke that all my family except for me were lawyers. My sister's a social worker. My two brothers, my father, about a half dozen uncles, and about 20 cousins are all attorneys. And my father and my two brothers got me out of quite a bit of legal entanglements, lawsuits, stuff like that. And my friends are like, wow, they really were great to you. They spent so much time, during your eviction, fighting for your right, and then your lawsuit and your threats. And
amazing.
I said, the reason they did that was they didn't want me living in their basement. It was all self-preservation. It wasn't for me. It was for them. But no, thank God that my family never really stopped supporting me and loaning me money, and just being.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I got lucky that way because I know other people that don't have.
Do you think they believed in you through the threat of things?
No.
Not at all.
Yeah, they believed in me, but they were concerned that I had gone off the
rails,
deep end.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have this in the book, but my father, who was a tax attorney, and he was the managing partner of the oldest law firm in Philadelphia, very buttoned up. And he wanted, me to succeed. And I said, Dad, you know how you can help me? This is before I had to borrow money from him. Is I'm writing these FOIAs, and everything now is an appeal, and I know they're screwing me over. Can you look at these and put them into legalese? And that kind of radicalized him. He couldn't believe, what they were denying me. And he started writing these very eloquent legal letters that got me information.
That's amazing.
And also won him over to my side. And he understood what I was up against. And if he doubted me before, he stopped. And that was unconsciously
when was that?
That was like, once I started looking at the FBI and the CIA. And I was trying to get Manson's prison records, parole records.
So it's early on.
Oh, it was like probably 6 months after. And he was helping me. It took me 2 years to get about half of what they had on Manson, but they didn't want to give me anything. And I wouldn't have gotten what I got. And a lot of it was critically important without my father.
So that's a beautiful piece to the story that I've never heard.
Yeah.
Because that would have never unlocked your 20-year commitment to this, because it would have been shut down early on.
I was shut down. And then, I mean, it was like, why don't you use somebody who's in your across the country, really cool. But who wants you to, and he was like delighted to do it. And he would stay up late at night writing it, because I'd get them like it'd be midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning his time. And he was, on the verge of retirement then. But I also think it kind of energized him, because he'd been doing tax law forever. Yeah. How interesting is that? Yeah. Then he got to see, stuff about government corruption and Bugliosi. It was interesting to me, once he started seeing the stuff I was exposing about Bugliosi, he said, that book came out, I read it, and I thought, wow, this guy has an ego. Then I saw him do interviews, and he goes, I never trusted him. I mean, attorneys and I've heard this from other attorneys, especially, criminal attorneys, prosecutors aren't supposed to boast that they've never lost a case.
Yeah.
Because there are innocent people who are prosecuted, and you're supposed to lose cases. And he said he had never lost a case.
Wow.
He would do anything to convict, and as I showed, including lie.
Amazing.
So that was a great moment for my father and I.
I bet it began a spark of interest that probably was good for him. It was like a collaboration at that point.
Unfortunately, he wasn't around for
Very
when
long.
the book was published.
Yeah.
But he was around long enough to know that it was going to happen.
And he really did believe in it then.
Yeah, he did.
Cool.
And my mom was, I think she was 91 when it came out.
Wow.
And she was feisty. She still drove, really smart. I mean, really capable. And the day the book came out, she was at Barnes & Noble in suburban Philadelphia, waiting for them to open the door at 9 o'clock, like looking at her watch.
91.
And then she goes into the store, and they have it on a display case. And she goes, no, my son wrote this book. It goes up here.
That's amazing.
And, she's like your friend. She's Italian.
Yeah.
Her parents were immigrants. So she's tough, and you don't screw with an Italian woman.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Super cool story, man. I love this. I'm just going to glance at this, make sure I didn't leave anything crazy out. I feel like we've talked about some fun things. If you could write another, I was going to write, like, what do you want to write about now? But you're talking about the continuation. If that gets complete,
when the book was done, I really thought, I'm not going to wake up thinking about Charles Manson anymore. I'll do something about rainbows and princesses and fairy tales for children. It's like, nope.
Yeah, you don't want to go near it.
Yeah, as soon as I turned the manuscript in, it was really weird. But, I got the assignment the day after my 40th birthday.
Mm-hmm. Like 99. The midlife questioning everything.
Yeah, and then we turned it in, the final draft, Dan and I, on my birthday, or the day after my birthday, 20 years to the day that I had gotten the call.
That's
just
incredible.
By coincidence.
Yeah.
And I forget what your question. Oh, yeah. So I thought when we turned and I hit send, Dan's like, are you ready? And we're on the phone. I go, yeah, I'm just hitting send. And we thought it was going to, we had already been through a few drafts and notes, but the editor was, Judy Claim was fantastic. She didn't ask for any radical, it was mostly grammatical stuff and, a little bit of, trimming and things, but nothing at all that upset me. I really thought that was it. I wasn't going to ever think about Manson again, but that lasted a week. Yeah. And then when the book came out and it was out there, then I started getting information from people. And then when I did Rogan, which kind of changed everything, that wasn't 6 or 7 months after the book came out. Then it got this massive audience that it didn't have before. So
that was a Hail Mary.
That was lucky. Yeah. I had a friend I mentioned him, Greg Fitzsimmons.
Who's friends with him?
Was friends with him, and was his roommate in Boston when they were struggling comics. And he's been on Rogan's show.
And if you didn't know him, he wouldn't have read the book, and you would have never had that audience. I wouldn't be sitting here either, but
yeah, I'd be back in New York driving a carriage. Who knows?
What do you think would have happened? Because it wasn't going to go like it did.
Yeah, no, I honestly think so. The book came out in June of 2019. Rogan discovered it. Fitz had tried to get me on with Rogan before the book came out because he's a good friend. Yeah. And he said Rogan is ADD. He loves him, but he's like
busy. Yeah.
He's all over, and he does no staff. He's got Jamie.
Yeah.
And this was even before the Spotify deal. I heard today he still has like just 2 guys. Yeah. And he said, Joe, you're going to love this book. And Joe, whatever. Yeah. And then nothing happened. And then Fitz was doing the show again in March, 7 months after the book came out. And he said, give me a synopsis. Let me give him something on paper. Yeah. I'm not going to give him the whole book because it didn't work, because I had gotten in the advance. So I gave him a 1-page synopsis. And then I got a call from him that afternoon. He goes, O'Neill, I just changed your life. I said, what? He goes, I just finished with Joe, and he's calling you tonight. He can't wait to have you on.
That's huge. The biggest platform in the world.
Yeah. So then that was March. But I think had I not done Rogan, at that point, the book was probably not going to have any more printings, maybe have one round of paperbacks.
And no one would know about it in 20 years. You know what I mean? Like, would it have stuck around enough?
Yeah.
I'm like, geez, what a loss that would have been.
So he was the game changer, and
that's great.
we were number 4 on the New York Times paperback bestseller nonfiction list this week. It's been on 5 weeks.
That's amazing.
It's just
And it's gonna now. I think it'll resurge even more now, especially after Trump gets shot and all the shit that's going on. People are like, "What is so obvious?"
And we still don't know. We still don't know.
But the nature of how things are now, it's like your book is a really good starting point for people.
Yeah.
And so is John Mark's book, which they sort of tie together.
I had no idea there was an audio of that. I'm going to get it.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah. But his book is a lot of endnotes too, and that's the one thing about the audio books you can't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good starting point for people to get curious. I mean, and then,
believe me, if people are listening, I'm happy with that. I mean, even if they listen to a podcast and don't buy the book, I'm just want.
Well, when I got your book 4 years ago, whenever it was, I first jumped to chapter whatever it was with MK Ultra.
Oh, did you?
I wanted to go right to it because I'd heard your interview, and I'm like, that's what I want first. But then I went back and read it from the beginning to the end, and then listened to it on audio. And
I've never read it like that, like jump to. I wonder how. I guess, yeah. I mean, each chapter is kind of a different book.
Yeah.
Because that's chapter 11, I think.
Yep. Yeah, it was 11 because I highlighted, tabbed it, and I was like, this, because I just love that subject matter. It's fascinating, right? It's like the most incredible part of human history, as far as Western history.
Right.
Anyway, it's just crazy stuff. But I hope you keep writing, and I hope that this next book is successful too.
I hope so too. I hope it happens.
It will.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I really enjoyed connecting with you, brother.
Yeah, thank you. And you've got good timing because now the recycle truck is here to.
Cool. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was fun. Thank you.
All right, cool.
Right on.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.